I was surprised to discover how little I knew of Indigenous people in the summer of 2016 when I took my first Indigenous Studies course on colonial encounters. There I learned about the effects of colonization on Indigenous people. For my research essay that year, I focused on resistance to colonization in Australia and was horrified to learn about the atrocities that took place there. That course made me realize that there was still a great deal for me to learn about Indigenous people. In INDG 3102, I've been surprised again, for in this course, I've been made aware of how much influence the media has had on my perceptions of Indigenous people. Since my youth, media portrayal shaped my views. I have unintentionally relied on media to teach me about Native life and history. I was bombarded with images of Indigenous people as sidekicks, princesses, or savages my entire life, until those images became embedded in my mind. It was Real Injun that tied the course together for me through its exploration of the Indigenous stereotypes in many of the films we covered in our course. It was how the stereotypes evolved over the decades that was very interesting, such as Edison being the first to introduce Indigenous people to film audiences. He filmed the Hopi Snake Dance and Sioux Ghost Dance. But like audiences that saw it at the time, I have no knowledge of whether those dances or outfits on screen are genuine or not. I trusted what I was seeing. Edison's audiences saw Indigenous people performing what they were told was an authentic Native dance, and so, like me, they probably believed it. I grew up watching many old 1940s and 50s film westerns on television, not realizing how much influence the images of Indigenous people were having on me. I most often saw movies that depicted the savage Indigenous warrior as a violent threat to civilized society. And this was evident, for example, in Stagecoach, directed by John Ford. Here, Native men were the stereotypical savages. Many of Ford's films depicted Indigenous men in this way, and during the early weeks of this course, I saw this stereotype. I'd heard of Ford, having seen many of his films, but never knew until now of his role in constructing the myth of the savage Indian. Together with John Wayne, Ford's movies showed white men defeating hordes of murdering savages as part of their civilizing of the Old West. In Smoke Signals, Thomas and Victor discussed John Wayne as being the toughest cowboy of them all. Now in my mind, Wayne's image in Ford's movies are little more than displays of thinly veiled bigotry towards Indigenous people. I never thought of Indigenous people as savages, though. For me, they were tragic figures, because I knew how it ended for them in the Old West. And although they were portrayed as violent in these old westerns, I often felt they had good reason given what we did to them. It was during the 1970s and 80s when I was a teenager that films and TV began portraying Indigenous people in a more sympathetic light. Little Big Man Jack Crab was the main character. The Indigenous people were sidekicks but more complex characters than the old Ford westerns. Here, Chief Dan George was an Indigenous man, playing an Indigenous role, and not a white actor, like Henry Brandon as Chief Scar in The Searchers. I'm sorry to say I never paid attention to the fact that Indigenous people were only seen in supporting roles with little character development. The main characters were usually white people, and the stories told from their point of view. I saw this in Dances with Wolves. Graham Greene was a supporting character, and although Kicking Bird was more fleshed out, the film's hero was the white soldier Dunbar. So while the film treated Indigenous people sympathetically, in reality, they were still robbed of a voice. In other stories, Indigenous people were sidekicks. Tonto and the Lone Ranger, perhaps the most famous example, was an Indigenous man who served as a servant or decoration to the white hero. And it's embarrassing to admit, I had not realized until now how accepting I was of this stereotype. By the end of the 20th century, films and TV reformulated how they depicted Indigenous people. In almost all the films I watched growing up, Indigenous people were placed in historical settings. Because of those movies, this was how I always pictured Indigenous people. So I was surprised to see Indigenous people in contemporary settings. Smoke Signals, and my favorite of the course, Well Rider, offered marvelous portrayals of contemporary Indigenous life. And having been raised on TV shows like Bonanza, it was a genuine surprise to see television shows featuring contemporary Indigenous people. On television, the CBC gave us a realistic portrayal in North of 60, and the show used Indigenous actors to play Indigenous roles. I was pleased to see this network increase Indigenous visibility on national television. Mohawk Girls was a wonderful and funny television show that mocked the stereotypes. These were intelligent and complex women, not squaws or princesses. I was glad to finally see Indigenous people taking ownership of their images in movies like The Fast Runner, which was unmistakably Indigenous. It was created by Indigenous people with characters played by Indigenous people, featuring a story from their oral tradition. I was disappointed when the recent version of The Lone Ranger featured Johnny Depp, for there were many Indigenous actors that could have played that part. I've always felt it unfair that white actors played Indigenous roles. I think it ridiculous that studios still do not understand that these parts should be played by Indigenous actors. I was particularly taken with the images of Indigenous women in this course. I remember when Disney's Pocahontas was first released and the debates around its inaccuracies. Pocahontas is the epitome of the primitive Indian princess. The course provided documentaries that I had never seen that showcased the hard work being done by female Indigenous filmmakers. It was the Red Cloth campaign, however, that was the most moving for me. I have to admit I was unprepared for how emotional it would be to tie a red ribbon around a tree on behalf of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Although we never covered it in this course, Indigenous stereotypes can be found in comics. Now, having taken the course, it occurred to me there were very few Indigenous characters in the Marvel Universe. Watt Wingfoot here was a sidekick to the Human Torch, and Thunderbird, an X-Men killed off in an early mission. Now as comic books become movies, I've noticed the stereotypes continue. When I went to see DC's Wonder Woman, I immediately recognized the stereotypes behind the chief character as one of Wonder Woman's sidekicks. The prevalence of these stereotypes of Indigenous people is the result of our ignorance. Courses such as this are valuable to people like myself because it makes us aware of those on-screen stereotypes. As a result of this course, I now take notice of Indigenous stereotypes when I watch television or movies. For a long time, media distorted images of Indigenous people. By taking control of their images, I hope they can create ones that counteract those racist images. I believe that change is possible, and courses like this help to address this injustice.